What would you do if you discovered at 50 years old that your entire life had been a beautiful lie? That every kiss, every embrace, every whispered, "I love you," to your husband was nothing more than a performance you didn't even know you were giving? Margaret Ellis asked herself this question on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in September, standing in her kitchen with a wedding ring on her finger and tears streaming down her face, because for the first time in 5 decades, she finally understood why she had never felt complete. This is not a story about betrayal. This is not a story about scandal or shame or the destruction of a family. This is a story about a woman who spent 50 years drowning in plain sight, surrounded by people who loved her, and yet feeling more alone than anyone could ever imagine. And this is a story about how one unexpected encounter with a 30-year-old woman named Elena Vance would shatter everything Margaret thought she knew about herself, and ultimately set her free. But freedom, as Margaret would soon discover, comes with a price. And sometimes, the most terrifying journey we ever take is the one that leads us directly into our own hearts. Margaret Ellis had been married to Robert Ellis for 27 years. They had met in college, married at 23, and built what everyone considered to be a perfect life. Robert was a successful architect. Margaret had been a literature professor at the local university for over 2 decades. They had 2 children, Daniel, now 25, and Sophie, 22, both successful, both loving, both completely unaware that their mother had been slowly suffocating for their entire lives. From the outside, the Ellis family was the definition of American success. A beautiful colonial home in Connecticut. Family vacations to Europe every summer. Sunday dinners that brought everyone together around a mahogany table that had been in Margaret's family for 3 generations. But what no one saw, what Margaret herself refused to see for most of her life, was the emptiness that lived inside her chest. That hollow feeling that appeared every time Robert touched her. That strange sense of disconnection that followed her through her days like a shadow she couldn't escape. Margaret had learned early in life to ignore this feeling. She had learned to call it stress, or fatigue, or simply the natural consequence of a busy life. She had learned to push it down, to bury it beneath responsibilities and obligations and the endless demands of being a wife, a mother, a professor, a friend. She had learned to survive. But she had never learned to live. Everything changed on a Thursday afternoon in late August. Margaret was attending an academic conference in Boston, presenting a paper on feminist themes in Victorian literature, a subject she had devoted her career to studying, perhaps because she understood, on some unconscious level, what it meant to be a woman trapped by the expectations of her time. The conference was held in a historic hotel downtown, all marble floors and crystal chandeliers and the kind of quiet elegance that Margaret had always appreciated. She was standing in the lobby after her presentation, feeling that familiar emptiness settling into her bones, when she heard a voice behind her. "Professor Ellis. I just wanted to say, your presentation was extraordinary." Margaret turned around. And in that moment, in that single, ordinary moment, her entire world shifted on its axis. The woman standing before her was young, early 30s, perhaps, with dark curly hair that fell past her shoulders and eyes the color of warm honey. She was wearing a simple blue dress and carrying a leather messenger bag, and she was looking at Margaret with an expression of genuine admiration that made something flutter unexpectedly in Margaret's chest. "I'm Elena Vance," the woman said, extending her hand. "I'm a doctoral student at Columbia. I've read everything you've ever published. Your analysis of suppressed female identity in Victorian literature practically shaped my entire dissertation." Margaret shook her hand. And later, she would remember this moment with perfect clarity, the warmth of Elena's palm against hers, the slight calluses on her fingers that suggested she was a writer who still preferred pen and paper, the way Elena's smile seemed to illuminate something dark and forgotten inside Margaret's soul. "That's very kind of you to say," Margaret replied, and she was surprised by how steady her voice sounded, because inside, something was happening that she didn't understand. Something was awakening. They had coffee together that afternoon. Then dinner that evening. Then breakfast the next morning, because Elena's hotel was just 2 blocks from Margaret's, and it seemed natural, somehow, to continue their conversation about literature and feminism and the ways that society constrains women into roles they never chose. Margaret told herself that this was simply an intellectual connection. A meeting of minds. The kind of mentorship that happened all the time in academic circles. But she knew, even then, that she was lying to herself. Because when Elena laughed, Margaret felt it in her entire body. When Elena leaned close to make a point, Margaret found herself holding her breath. When their fingers accidentally touched reaching for the same book at a used bookstore on Newbury Street, Margaret felt an electric current run through her veins that she had never, not once in her entire life, felt with Robert. The conference ended. Margaret went home to Connecticut. And for 3 weeks, she tried to pretend that nothing had happened. But Elena had given her a phone number. And late at night, when Robert was asleep beside her, Margaret would lie awake staring at her phone, at those 10 digits that represented something she couldn't name, something she was terrified to acknowledge. Finally, on a Sunday evening when Robert was watching football and the children were living their own lives far from home, Margaret sent a text message. Just 3 words, "I can't stop thinking." Elena's response came within minutes, "Neither can I." What followed was a month of phone calls. Long, rambling conversations that lasted until 2 or 3 in the morning. They talked about books and art and music. They talked about their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. They talked about everything except what was actually happening between them, because naming it would make it real, and making it real would require Margaret to face something she had been running from her entire life. It was Elena who finally broke the silence around the truth. "Margaret," she said one night, her voice soft and careful through the phone. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Have you ever been in love? Really, truly in love?" Margaret closed her eyes. Robert was asleep down the hall. The house was quiet around her, this beautiful house she had lived in for 2 decades, this life she had built so carefully, brick by brick. "I don't know," she whispered. And the admission felt like falling from a great height. "I think you do know," Elena said gently. "I think you've always known. I think you've just been too afraid to say it out loud." Margaret began to cry then, silently, desperately, with her hand pressed over her mouth so Robert wouldn't hear. Because Elena was right. She had always known. She had known at 16 when she felt things for her best friend that she didn't understand. She had known at 20 when she kissed Robert for the first time and felt nothing but obligation. She had known at 30, at 40, every year of her life, but she had buried the truth so deep that she had almost managed to forget it existed. She was attracted to women. She had always been attracted to women. And she had spent 50 years pretending otherwise because the world she grew up in hadn't allowed for any other possibility. "I'm 50 years old," Margaret said through her tears. "I have a husband. I have children. I have a career and a reputation and a life that took decades to build. I can't just." "You can," Elena said. "People do. It happens more than you think. Coming out later in life. Realizing who you truly are after years of not knowing. Margaret, it's not too late. It's never too late to become yourself." Margaret wanted to believe her. She wanted to believe that it wasn't too late, that 50 wasn't too old to start over, that the life she had built could be dismantled without destroying everyone she loved. But she also knew what coming out would mean. She knew the conversations she would have to have with Robert, with Daniel, with Sophie. She knew the judgment she would face from colleagues and neighbors and the members of her book club and the parents at her children's old school. She knew that some people would support her and some people would abandon her and some people would never look at her the same way again. And she knew that Elena, young, beautiful, brilliant Elena, deserved someone who could love her openly, freely, without the baggage of a 50-year-old closet. "You're 20 years younger than me," Margaret said. "You have your whole life ahead of you. You don't want to spend it with someone like me. Someone like you." Elena's voice was sharp with frustration. "Margaret, you're the most intelligent, passionate, fascinating person I've ever met. When I talk to you, I feel like I'm finally speaking my native language after years of struggling with translation. You make me think differently, feel differently, exist differently. Age is just a number. Love is what matters. And I. She stopped. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. And you what? Margaret whispered. I'm falling in love with you, Elena said. I know it's complicated. I know it's messy. I know there are 1,000 reasons why this shouldn't work. But I'm falling in love with you anyway, and I don't know how to stop. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed next to Robert, this man she had shared her life with for nearly 3 decades, and she thought about all the years she had wasted. All the mornings she had woken up feeling wrong in her own skin. All the nights she had closed her eyes and imagined something different, someone different, a life that fit her instead of one she had to squeeze herself into like a costume. She thought about what it would mean to stay. To continue pretending. To spend the next 30 years of her life the same way she had spent the first 50, surviving instead of living, existing instead of feeling, drowning in plain sight. And she thought about what it would mean to leave. The pain she would cause. The chaos she would create. The terrifying, exhilarating possibility of finally becoming the person she was always meant to be. By morning, she had made her decision. She told Robert on a Saturday afternoon in October. The leaves were changing outside, all reds and golds and oranges, and Margaret thought it was appropriate somehow, that she was choosing to transform herself during the season of transformation. She sat him down in the living room, this room where they had celebrated anniversaries and comforted crying children and built a life together that looked perfect from the outside and felt hollow from within. I have to tell you something, she said. And it's going to hurt you, and I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for everything. But I can't pretend anymore. Robert looked at her with confusion in his eyes, this man she had loved in her own way, this good man who had never been enough, who could never have been enough, because he was fundamentally the wrong person for her. I'm gay, Margaret said. And the words, spoken aloud for the first time in her life, felt like breaking through the surface of water after 50 years underwater. I've always been gay. I just didn't, I couldn't, I didn't let myself know. Robert's face went through several expressions, confusion, disbelief, hurt, anger. Margaret watched them all, feeling each one like a knife in her chest. There's someone else, isn't there? He asked finally. Yes, Margaret admitted. Her name is Elena. She's a doctoral student. And I'm in love with her, Robert. Really, truly in love for the first time in my life. The conversation that followed was the hardest of Margaret's life. Robert cried. He shouted. He accused her of destroying their family, of throwing away everything they had built together. And Margaret sat through all of it, absorbing his pain, knowing that she deserved his anger even as she knew that staying would have been the crueler choice. In the end, Robert asked her to leave. And Margaret did, walking out of her home with a single suitcase and no clear idea of where she was going, only knowing that she was finally walking toward herself instead of away from herself. She went to New York. To Elena. To the small apartment in Brooklyn where Elena lived surrounded by books and papers and half-finished mugs of tea. Elena opened the door, saw Margaret standing there with her suitcase and her tear-streaked face and her 50 years of suppressed identity, and pulled her inside without saying a word. They held each other for a long time that night. And later, sitting on Elena's small balcony overlooking the lights of Brooklyn, Margaret felt something she had never felt before, peace. Complete, overwhelming, bone-deep peace. I'm scared, she admitted. I know, Elena said. Me too. This isn't going to be easy. My children, my daughter isn't speaking to me. My son says he needs time to process. My colleagues don't know how to act around me. My mother, Margaret's voice broke. My mother told me she's ashamed of me. Elena took her hand. But are you ashamed of yourself? Margaret thought about the question. really thought about it. And for the first time in 50 years, she found that the answer was no. She wasn't ashamed. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't sorry for who she was or who she loved. She was terrified. She was uncertain. She was mourning the loss of the life she had known and the relationships that might never recover. But she was also, finally, completely, undeniably alive. No, she said. I'm not ashamed. I'm proud. For the first time in my life, I'm proud of who I am. The months that followed were difficult. The divorce was painful but ultimately amicable. Robert, to his credit, found his way to a kind of acceptance, even if it took time. Sophie eventually came around, showing up at Elena's apartment one day with tears in her eyes and an apology on her lips, saying that she had never seen her mother so happy and that happiness was all she had ever wanted for her. Daniel remained distant for longer, but he too eventually reached out, asking careful questions, trying to understand. Margaret's mother never fully accepted her. This remained a wound that would never completely heal. But Margaret learned to live with it, to grieve the relationship she had wanted while appreciating the identity she had finally claimed. And Elena was everything Margaret had never dared to dream of. Patient and passionate, young in years but wise in heart, she loved Margaret with a fierceness that sometimes took Margaret's breath away. They fought occasionally, as all couples do. They navigated the challenges of their age difference with honesty and humor. They built a life together that was nothing like the one Margaret had left behind, smaller, messier, more uncertain in some ways, but infinitely more authentic. On Margaret's 51st birthday, Elena took her to Boston. Back to the hotel where they had first met. Back to the spot in the lobby where Elena had approached her after her presentation. "This is where my life began," Margaret said, looking around at the marble floors and crystal chandeliers that had witnessed her transformation. "Not the day I was born. Not the day I got married. Here. This moment. You." Elena smiled, that warm, honey-eyed smile that still made Margaret's heart flutter. "It was always there," she said. "You were always there. I just helped you find your way to yourself." And Margaret realized that this was the truest thing anyone had ever said to her. She had always been there, underneath all the layers of expectation and obligation and fear. The woman who loved women. The woman who felt deeply and lived passionately and refused to be contained by society's narrow definitions. That woman had always existed, waiting patiently for the moment when Margaret would finally be brave enough to let her out. Margaret reached for Elena's hand, intertwining their fingers in that way that still felt miraculous, even after all these months. "Thank you," she said. "For seeing me before I could see myself. For loving me when I didn't know how to love myself. For being brave enough for both of us until I could find my own courage." "Thank you," Elena replied, "for teaching me that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be. And for showing me what love really looks like, not the fairy tale version, but the real kind. The kind that requires sacrifice and courage and the willingness to burn down everything you've built in order to build something true." They stood there together as the evening light faded through the hotel windows, two women who had found each other across 20 years and countless obstacles, two hearts that had recognized each other in a crowded lobby and refused to let go. And Margaret understood, finally, what she wished she had understood at 20, at 30, at 40, that the greatest gift we can give ourselves is permission to be exactly who we are. That hiding is its own kind of death. That even if coming out means losing some people, staying hidden means losing yourself. She had spent 50 years drowning. But now, at last, she could breathe. If you're watching this and you're struggling with your own identity, wherever you are in your journey, I hope Margaret's story reminds you that it's never too late. It's never too late to become yourself. It's never too late to find love. It's never too late to stop surviving and start living. And if this story touched something in you, if it made you feel seen, or hopeful, or less alone, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling me your thoughts, your own experiences with coming out or self-discovery or late-in-life transformation. Because stories like Margaret's matter. They matter so much. And every time we share them, we make the world a little safer for someone else to tell their truth. I believe in you. And I hope, wherever you are, that you find the courage to believe in yourself too.